Okay, we're going to get going. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. You'll see we're a largish panel, so we're a bit squashed up here at the front, but we're going to play musical chairs and take it in turns to sit down. So this session is about persistent identifiers in scholarly communications, and I'm delighted we have a great set of panelists who are representing both organisations that create PIDs and then that use them in various different ways. So I think we're in for a treat. I realise that I have stupidly left my old job title on this slide, so my new job title is actually Director of Community Engagement and Support at Orchid. I'm going to kick things off with a little bit of a general introduction to persistent identifiers and why they're important in our world, and then hand it over to the others to talk through how they use them in their organisations, how they create them and use them. Our plan is to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. We're aiming for half an hour for questions, so we're going to attempt to be strict with each other in terms of the timing. So please do be thinking of any questions that you might have while we're talking. We have a few of our own if you don't have any, but we're very much hoping that there'll be plenty of questions from the audience. Okay, so those of you that have heard me or anybody really from Orchid and probably other organisations talking about persistent identifiers will know that we like to think of ourselves as part of the plumbing of research infrastructure. So the stuff that kind of happens below the surface but makes things easy, hopefully, and smooth for the people who are actually working in scholarly communications, primarily the researchers and also the organisations that they work for. So this sort of digital plumbing idea where we're really providing these foundational services that will both improve scholarly communications and also, and importantly, build trust in digital communications. And persistent identifiers are an important part of that. And the reason for this is that basically names are messy. There are all sorts of things that share the same name, or one thing that can have many names. Names can get transliterated into different languages, abbreviated, there are acronyms. There's lots of reasons why there's a lot of ambiguity around names. And this is why persistent identifiers exist, really, and there's a lot of them. Actually, you know, one of the earliest ones in our world, at least, was the ISBN, and I remember back in the good old, bad old days of print, we'd have those humongous, I grew up in the UK, as you can probably tell, British books in print, which were two enormous, big red volumes, of sort of paper-thin, sort of toilet paper that you would plough your way through and then attempt by eye to match up the ISBN in your British books in print with the one that was on the book, and it's all a bit of a nightmare. We have happily moved beyond that, and these are some of the sort of persistent identifiers that you will, I'm sure, all be familiar with, and you'll be hearing about three of these, so Orchid from myself, and then Ringgold and DataCite from Christine and Laura shortly. Standards are also a really important part of the research infrastructure, and some of you may have heard there was a session yesterday on standards. I think there's a couple more during the course of the programme. So again, really important way of ensuring that not just there are persistent identifiers, but that they're used in a standard way, and that all of us are sort of adhering to the same standards so that we know what to expect, and so that the researchers we serve know what to expect. And again, these are just a few examples of the standards organisations that I think we're all working with. So just to say a little bit about Orchid specifically, this is our vision. It's a new vision statement. We're rather proud of it. We think it sums up quite neatly what we do, who we are. Very importantly, I'd like to make the distinction that we're not just for academic researchers. Our vision is that everybody who participates in research, scholarship and innovation, so this is across academia but also outside of academia in the commercial world, we want them to be uniquely identified, and the unique obviously is very critical there, but also really importantly to be connected to their contributions and affiliations, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And again, very importantly, that this will happen across disciplines, borders and time. So Orchid is an interdisciplinary organisation. We mint IDs for everyone from the humanities to biomedicine and everything in between. We are completely international, so our IDs work across borders. It doesn't matter where you move to, and really importantly through time, so that an Orchid ID is something that you can carry with you throughout your whole career. So the idea is that it doesn't matter how many times your name changes, how many times you change job, organisation, country, or even discipline, your Orchid ID can be constant and persistent throughout your career. So what are we? I think probably most of you are somewhat familiar with Orchid. We're an open, not-for-profit organisation. We are supported by our members, and I know some of you are here in the room, so thank you very much. And we collaborate and innovate with organisations like you. We provide unique identifiers for researchers, and those are free of charge to the researchers, always have been, always will be. As I say, that your membership fees help support us in being able to do that. And the idea is that they can then claim their own Orchid ID and use it to connect themselves with their works and affiliations. And we work with your organisations, with our member organisations, to enable interoperability between the systems that these researchers are using so that they can connect that information not just to your system or systems, but across all the systems that they're using. And ultimately what we're trying to do is to enable our kind of mantra of enter once, reuse often, so that instead of researchers having to consistently repeat the same, re-enter the same information time and time again and do so manually with all the risks that entails, that they can do it once and then the information will flow through all these systems. So I'm just going to show a couple of infographics quickly to show how this works in practice. And starting with the funders, you have the researcher at the beginning of the process. More and more funders are now requiring Orchid IDs as part of the grant application process. Many more of them request them. The researcher enters their Orchid ID in an authenticated way, which means that they are not just keying or copying in their Orchid ID, but they are pinged to the Orchid website to log in and say, yes, this really is me, and then attach that information to their Orchid ID. So you get this kind of validated assertion between the researcher and their organisation, in this case the funder. So the funder's collecting them, they include the ID in their metadata and display it in their funding database. They assert the award and connect it back to the Orchid record, and again this is really important because it's creating that validated connection between the grant applicant, the researcher, and their award. And then in an ideal world, they're also connecting that information on in other directions. So they're pulling information back from the Orchid record into their systems so that the next time the researcher comes to apply for a grant, they don't have to re-enter all that information again. It's already sitting there. They can update it or sort of re-update it from their Orchid record, and then synchronizes and the information flows through to the other systems that the researcher's using. And the same thing happens with publishing. Broadly, I think Laura's going to talk a little bit more in a minute about the DataCite auto-update with Orchid, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. Some of you will be familiar with the open letter that a number of publishers have signed in support of Orchid and committing to requiring their authors to use an Orchid ID when they submit a manuscript. And again, I think a couple of you in the room have signed that letter, thank you. But other than that, sort of similar kind of workflow, and again for employers, so the research institutions where researchers are working. And taken all together, what we hope is that this is going to create this kind of complete 360 loop between the researcher, his or her organisation, their publisher and their funder, and including their association as well. And associations typically will play more than one of these roles, so that there's this sort of complete flow of information between those different organisations, and that it's a validated flow of information, so that each time the user is interacting with Orchid, they do it in a validated way, so that you're building that trust, which is so important to the research infrastructure. So that's all I'm going to say about Orchid. Obviously, we're hoping you're going to have plenty of questions for us at the end, but the rest of the session, we're going to first start off with some persistent identifier creators. So Christine Orr of Ringgold is going to kick us off. They create organisation IDs, and then Laura Rueda of DataCite will talk about DOIs for data sets that they create. We'll then move on to PIDs in systems, and Richard Wynne from Aries is going to talk about PIDs really in manuscript submission system, and then finishing off with some examples of PIDs in practice, first in publishing with David Crotty from OUP, and then Hilary Corbett from Northeastern University will talk about PIDs in libraries. And then, as I say, plenty of time for Q&A for you. So I'm going to hand over to Christine. Thank you.